Singaporeans have handed a spectacular victory to Tharman Shanmugaratnam as their country's first non-Chinese president and have in the process illustrated a growing trend towards robust race relations among the city-state's majority and various ethnic minorities. People of Indian origin in Singapore constitute only 7% of its 5.64 million population, but Shanmugaratnam won a whopping 70+% votes. Known as a man of great intellect and empathy, both in Singapore and abroad, the 66-year-old will be sworn in next week. It's a measure of his popularity that he was widely seen as the likeliest prime minister once the incumbent Lee Hsien Loong stepped down. Instead, he chose to go for a role that is largely ceremonial because he thought he would not be good at being prime minister, as well as his belief in encouraging younger leadership. To understand what Tharman Shanmugaratnam's rise means, Mayank Chaya Report spoke to the well-known Singapore-based journalist, writer, and public speaker, Ravi Velloor. Welcome to Mayank Chaya Reports. Ravi, it's a great pleasure to have you on.
Wonderful to see you, Mike.
How do you view the spectacular win of Tharman Shanmugaratnam in the broader socio-political and cultural context?
Well, Mike, I think you chose a very interesting word. You said spectacular. I'd also add the word startling because everyone expected a much closer contest. And, in this country, straw polls are not allowed. But even so, analysts can speculate. And most analysts had thought that Tharman Shanmugaratnam would win by maybe 55% of the vote. So what turned out was a true landslide, and that was totally unexpected. And to get more than 70% of the vote in a three-cornered contest was truly spectacular, as you put it. And the fact that he belongs to a minority community, the Indian community, so-called Indian community, is only 7% of Singapore, and that makes it even more startling.
It's interesting you mentioned 7%. It just struck me that a community with 7% in Singapore ends up having someone who scores 70% of popular vote, which is 10 times its demographic weight. It's quite extraordinary.
It is. And I think the key lesson of this presidential election is that the two pillars of Singapore's framework, which is multiracialism in society and meritocracy in government and business, and these two pillars are substantially intact. And for me, these are the two lessons that came out of the election.
From what I understand, reading about him, there was pretty wide consensus that he could have been the country's next prime minister. Why did he choose not to exercise that option? Of course, I read that he is in favor of the new generation of leadership now.
Well, it is true that, if you talk to the man in the street in Singapore, there is, or should I say there was, overwhelming desire to see Tharman as prime minister after Mr. Lee Hsien Loong, ends his tenure whenever he chooses to do that. And maybe it is Singapore's loss that it was not to be. But, Tharman himself ruled it out a few years ago, saying, and he explained it, he put it this way, saying that, look, I'm good at giving policy advice and working with other people and things, but perhaps prime minister is not the job that I might do well. And if he believes that to be the case, I think we must respect him for it. But that said and done, I think he has walked into what I believe is the perfect position for him and for Singapore.
This is a largely ceremonial figurehead sort of position as president. What kind of influence do you think he might be able to exercise, given that he has a stellar record as an economic thinker?
Mm-hmm. Well, Mike, you're right. It is a largely ceremonial position, as you put it. And the president's principal role is to safeguard the nation's reserves and to maintain the integrity of the civil service. But that said, there are 1,000 ways that an articulate, thoughtful, um, globally influential, respected person can influence things. And I'm sure that Thurman will find his own way of doing so without meddling in the government directly.
This is rather speculative, somewhat of a what if question. What if he had become the first non Chinese prime minister of Singapore? How do you think it might have been received?
Well, I think, as I told you, I think there was, huge uh, sentiment on the ground that he would make a wonderful prime minister, and that cuts across society. It cuts across, age and gender and race. But if the man says that he was not ready for it himself and didn't want a job, I think we shouldn't speculate. But I think to go a little step back a little bit into your question, although you didn't ask me that specifically, I'd say that we are in a very interesting position where today's Singaporean is willing to accept uh, somebody from a minority race. And judge him on the basis of his personality, on the basis of his character, on the basis of the intellectual capacity that he brings to his job, and his various qualities. And I think the Singaporean has done very well for himself by picking a wonderful president.
To slightly digress, it strikes me that wherever you look where Indians are, be it in this country where I am in the US, we are about
Hmm.
1% of the country's population, and yet we punch so much above our weight. I mean, on the Republican side, you have two aspirants of Indian origin. I mean, you have covered the community across the world for a long time. You have a particular expertise on that as well. What do you think makes it so effective for Indians everywhere to rise to position of power and influence?
Well, I think, Mike, I'm not any great expert on what you just asked me, but just from observations, uh, I think the Indian mind is conditioned in a very interesting way. In the first place, it teaches you to adjust to people and to situations. And it teaches you to work in multicultural, multilinguistic environments. And most Indians have grown up speaking more than one language, and every language is a universe and it builds your mind. And I think that sophistication, that ability to navigate tough situations and not be too daunted by something that seems pretty formidable at some point, but find a way around it. I think that translates, especially in corporate life, to what you're seeing in the United States, that ability to adjust. If you look at many of the Indians who've done well in your country, they have come from, they're the children of railway officials, civil servants, or maybe even military officials. And all these people, if you look at their parents, they've been transferred around the country. So they learn to move, they learn to adjust, they learn to make new friends, and they learn to navigate situations. And I think that really is the essence of the Indian mind. Plus the fact that two or three languages, and each language, as I said, is an entire thought process that resides in your mind. So the Indian mind is a very complex mind, and it's conditioned to adapt to change and to emerge from it uh, fairly successfully, I'd say.
Do you think with the rise of Thurman, and I don't know why they always address him by his first name because I saw everywhere he's referred to as Mr. Thurman. Do you think that in a way settles the debate whether or not Singapore is now ready for a minority prime minister at some point?
Yes, I think so. It does settle it, and I think it shows how far along the road Singapore has come as a nation, as a community, and it's the result of so many things that have come together, including the housing policy which, as Thurman himself pointed out a few years ago, it's seen as very intrusive that public housing, 80%, 85% of Singaporeans live in public housing. And in public housing has come one of the most intrusive policies where the state says the housing block should reflect the ethnic mix of the nation. So you're forced to live with Chinese neighbors, with Indian, Malay. Everyone has to pass each other's door and learn to live together. And I think, and I'm not taking credit for this thought, this is what Thurman himself said a few years ago, and I completely agree that this is the essence of the Singapore life, and that is manifesting today alongside high levels of education, knowledge of the world, and various other things to come together to say, hey, we have a good man for the job. He's the best for the job. Let's give it to him.
What do you think has caused this socio-cultural shift over the last few decades? I mean, there has been a history of some tensions, ethnic tensions, in terms of the way the community is structured. What do you think has happened in the last, say, 5, 8 years that has caused such a remarkable change?
I think, Mayank, that it would start with your country. The United States has made, especially the Trump era, has made certain obnoxious positions fairly, I wouldn't say acceptable, but more current and more used by leaders whom we elect to high office, and that has diminished, that has diluted the quality of the leadership. And whatever you say, the United States is still the city on the hill, and what happens in your country does affect the world, just like what happens in the country of your birth, India, does affect this region. So if the US gets more intolerant, and if political leaders in your country are able to say things in public which would be nose holding for a lot of other people, that makes it a little more acceptable to a bunch of idiots around the world to also use that same language. And the same goes for India. Let me make that very clear. What happens in India does not stay in India. And all of our nations in this part of the world, in Southeast Asia, that try to work with multicultural, multiracial, multi-religious societies and to keep them together, we get affected if the perception, whether it's true or not, I'm not passing judgment on it. If the perception prevails that India is being unfair to its minorities or being, mistreating its minorities, that affects this part of the world as well, because we too need India as a beacon. It's a beacon of democracy, it's a beacon of growth, and it's a beacon for people of various faiths living together in one umbrella. And we hope that India stays true to its faith of what it was, what it started as, and that the India project remains, that it is, that we reject the two-nation theory or the three-nation theory or whatever it is, and that we're one nation. And if India can keep that, we in Southeast Asia would also breathe a lot easier.
Indeed. I mean, that's a great sentiment to express here. There's some observation being made about the fact that he's the first non-Chinese president to be voted in. Tell me a bit about that. Why is it significant?
Well, as I said, Mike, as you said, it is true. He's the first non-Chinese, non-ethnic Chinese president that Singapore's had. And he was actually voted in a ballot that is a secret ballot. I mean, nobody can tell when you go into a voting booth what sentiments drives you to cast that vote, whether it's your race or your religion or what somebody told you or whatever biases. The fact that this man, by the way, his popularity has been consistent. If you look at the last two elections, he's outpolled his own party by a significant margin. And his constituency has had the highest number of votes for his party, which is the People's Action Party. So he not only is off the party, but he's also a man who has his own position in this country. And it's based on intellect, it's based on integrity, it's based on empathy, and it's based on hard work, because the way he treats his constituents, the way he deals with them, the way he tries to fix their problems and to give advice, and where what is possible, it's frank advice, sincerely given, and and that people thought that his appeal was only to his constituents, but it's very clear that it's spread across the nation, and that is something that is remarkable.
My sense is sitting here afar is that he seems to have risen above, outgrown in a sense, the political dynamic that he was in for a long time. He's a non-partisan sort of a figure now, not because he became president, but there were signs that he was already becoming that.
You could say that I would think that more than non-partisan, I'd say that Thurman has always had an independent streak in him. Uh, you cannot say that he's non-partisan because he worked within the party system for for all the years that he was in the government. I'm not talking about his civil service career, but when he was part of the party and part of the cabinet, obviously he's not partisan. He's bound by the rules of cabinet. Whatever he might have said in closed-door meetings, when they come out, they speak as one unit. And he thrived in that system, and he did very well. But he also successfully carved out an image for himself, a profile for himself of being independent, of being empathetic, and truly caring for ordinary Singaporeans. And what he's got today is the reward for that approach.
Speaking of his empathetic nature, a lot has been said about the fact that he's a gentlemanly politician, not given to bad mouthing rivals. Has that been a career long attribute?
I would say that, I don't think, um, frankly, that's not the style of bad mouthing people is not really the style in Singapore. I think,
I see.
yeah, I mean, and I think certainly Thurman himself is not the type to do that. I mean, during this campaign, there were a few issues that came up, and I think he dealt with them in a very mature way. He said he's not going to go there, he's not going to go here, and I think people appreciated him for that. But as I said, I mean, he stands above the fray, and that was so obvious. And I think and what you see is the fruit of that.
When does he take over? Is there a formal swearing in that happens?
It would be next week, actually. I think the current president, Halimah Yacob, she steps down on the 13th, and Thurman, President-elect Thurman, takes office the next day, which is 14th of September.
And just a minor detail, is there a sort of a resplendent, opulent residence that he moves into?
No, it's not. It's a very, it's called the Istana. Istana is Malay for government house. And it's space that he shares with the prime minister, so he doesn't have exclusive run of the property. It's a substantial property, but I don't think he's going to occupy it. His office will be there, but Singapore presidents don't generally occupy. It's not Rashtrapati Bhavan, if you ask me, in the sense that the Bhavan part of it is, is not used that much. So Mr. Thurman will be there to work during the day, and I guess his meetings will be held there. And probably more than a few times a week, he and the prime minister will cross paths along the corridors. So it's a very functional building, and I think he will continue to live in his own house, probably protected a little more than he was before. That's Singapore.
If Indians were looking at the model in Singapore, the equation between the prime minister and the president, is it similar to what we have in India?
Well, you could, in a sense, say that, but I don't think the president of India has a say in civil service appointments,
Yeah,
or in controlling the national reserves. I think
that's a
that's
big
very
difference.
much
That's a big
it's a big
difference, right?
it's a big difference, and but there are similarities in that President is seen as a Rashtrapati, as they say in India, the father of the nation, and he's a unifying figure. He belongs to everybody. He doesn't belong to a single party, or he should not. And I think Mr. Tharman, I think, will truly live up to that mandate. And I think that I appreciated the fact that he said, "Look, regardless of whether you voted for me or not, I want to be your president." So I think that's a very good approach, and I think some of the people who might have not have voted for him may have wondered why they didn't vote for him.
Right. Just last couple of things. One is I'm curious why the office has sway over civil service, as you mentioned, as well as reserves. Explain that to me.
I don't know, frankly.
Oh,
The reserves is because you need a custodian and somebody who puts another eye, because the government has its own interests, right? The first thing, I mean, among other things, aside from ruling effectively, is also to get re-elected.
right.
So the president's, the president doesn't need to get his party re-elected. So it's an outside eye. And he should be. His mandate is to think for the good of Singapore in a completely holistic way, which is also the mandate of the government. But the mandate of the government is also tempered by the fact that they also need to get re-elected. So there needs to be a balance, and I think the president, with his sagacity and with his wisdom, and that approach should always. I mean, and that's my understanding of the presidency.
Right. Just to conclude, in your immediate neighborhood, you have Malaysia, which also has a large population of Indian extraction. What do you think something like this does to the community there?
Mike, I think it's a lesson for the whole world, not just my neighbors, Malaysia and Indonesia. But while I celebrate, the tremendous vote that Mr. Tharman has got, I do wish that someday we would also have a candidate from the Malay community, Malay Muslim community, who's equally popular, equally well regarded in Singapore. And that will be the lesson that we would, be able to highlight to our neighbors without saying so in so many words. It's the fact that a truly meritocratic, race-blind society, and to me, that will be the day when Singapore truly becomes, spectacular.
Ravi, I'm interested to know from you about Mr. Thurman's Indian roots. Highlight some. I mean, I'm rather intrigued by that.
Well, I'd say his Indian roots are a bit of a misnomer, Mike. The reason being that, to begin with, he's a third generation Singaporean. And if you really go trace his ethnicity back 4 generations, it's not really Indian as much as Ceylonese Tamil. But the fact remains that the Indian civilization does impact, Ceylon and the Tamils in Ceylon greatly. And to that extent, you could say that he's of Indian origin, or at least culturally, he's certainly influenced. But in this country, what happens is, nobody goes into the specificities. So what happens is, there's just broad classifications of Chinese, Malay, Indian. So to that extent, he's of Indian origin. But if you really want to drill it down, I'd really think that he belongs to a highly evolved Ceylonese Tamil mind that has, that he's inherited. That's his tribal memory is probably goes back. And the Ceylonese Tamils have done great work in Singapore.
Right.
They've been including, National Airline and various other things. They're all, and great bureaucrats, great people in education, in medicine, have been Ceylonese Tamils. And Mr. Tharman belongs to that strain of
I see.
ethnic background. Yes.
Oh, that's fascinating. I'm glad you mentioned that. Thank you. We wrap it up on that note, Ravi.
Okay, buddy.